going to look at the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs was an incident that took place between the United States and Cuba. It was an unsuccessful attempt by the United States where we backed Cuban exiles to overthrow the government of the Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. Cuba used to be a democracy, but then their government was changed because Fidel Castro raised up an army and took over the country and became a dictator. Still today, Cuba is under his control. Why did we decide to go into Cuba and train the exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro? The U.S. broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba in January of 1961. Heavy tensions between the governments, the United States and Cuba, became apparent between the two countries. So, when and where? In April 17, 1961, 13 exiles are going to be armed with U.S. weapons. They are going to land at Bahía de Cochinos, which is the southern coast of Cuba, and it basically stands for the Bay of Pigs. The actual attack. It was evident from the first hour of fighting that the exiles were going to lose. President Kennedy did not send any extra help. Because of that, 90 exiles were killed and the rest have been taken prisoners. So the result of the failure, basically it's called the failure of the Bay of the Pigs, is going to result in Kennedy and the U.S. being embarrassed of this failure. And Castro is going to become very wary of the U.S., not wanting us near Cuba because we basically tried to replace him as the dictator of Cuba. So it ended up being a failure for our country. Later on, down the road, we're going to have what is called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, this is involved between the United States and Cuba. This is the closest the world has ever been to a nuclear war. You're going to have the United States versus USSR.
Can you please report to Ms.
Sorry about that. We're just going to pause.
Ms. Kinsmell, please report to Ms. Reno's room.
We're going to have the U.S. versus USSR, which is Russia, or the Soviet Union at this time. Cuba is right off the coast. It's 90 miles right off the coast, the state of Florida. That's why we were concerned what type of government that Cuba had, because it was so close to our coast. The USSR is going to develop a relationship with Fidel Castro because they are communists and they share a common enemy, us. So the USSR is going to place missiles in Cuba to prevent the U.S. from attacking them. The United States had missiles that if we can launch from our land and it will reach all the way to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union missiles were not as strong as our missiles. They can launch missiles, but it could only attack, the missiles will only attack Western Europe. It couldn't make it across the ocean to the United States. So they saw it as a perfect opportunity, with Cuba being right outside the coast, to put missiles in Cuba 90 miles outside the United States coast. So the summer of 1962, the USSR secretly built missiles in Cuba. At this time, the United States do not know that this is what the Soviet Union is doing, and Cuba's allowing them to do it. Fidel Castro saw it as an opportunity for protection. He didn't have to worry about another Bay of Pigs attack and a failure of him maintaining control of his country. So he saw it as a good thing to let the Soviets come over to Cuba and put nuclear missiles on his land. So finally, we find out in October of 1962, to be exact, October 15th. Photographs revealed the Soviet missiles. So Kennedy, he's our president this time, imposes a naval blockade to prevent more Soviet weapons on the island. So the face-off, tensions are going to begin to build on both sides. Khrushchev is going to write a letter proposing to remove Soviet missiles and personnel if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. They're then going to write another letter. It's the second letter. He's writing this letter to Kennedy. It's going to say, asking the USA to remove their missiles in Turkey. Now, Turkey's in Western Europe. Turkey is right outside the Soviet Union. We have missiles in Turkey, which we could use on the Soviet Union if they didn't remove their missiles from Cuba. The U.S. is going to agree to the first letter. We didn't agree to the second letter, so we didn't remove the missiles from Turkey. And tensions are going to ease between the two, the Soviet Union and the USA, because from that point on, we promised that we're going to leave Cuba alone. We're not going to go in and try to remove Fidel Castro anymore. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is going to be over. There's going to be further negotiations about removing more of the presence of the USSR in Cuba, and from that point on, we've never had like an instant where it's going to be a nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's it.